Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Logos Live. Really happy to have all of you with us. I think my screen is frozen, or maybe it's not. Uh, anyway, we have the preeminent New Testament scholar with us, Tom Schreiner. Tom Schreiner, or Thomas R. Schreiner, is the James Buchanan Harrison Professor of New Testament Interpretation and Professor of Biblical Theology and the Associate Dean of the School of Theology at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And what we're going to do today is have a conversation. We're going to hear about Tom, about his youth, about his years of ministry, about his scholarship, what he's doing now. And it's just going to be a casual conversation. What I want to invite all of you who are listening to do is please join in, tell us where you're listening from. Any questions at all that you have for Tom, please put them in the chat and we'll try and answer as many of those as possible, whether they are on the Pauline epistles, on Hebrews, on Revelation. We'll get to all that. So that said, I just want to welcome you, Tom, to Logos Live.
Thanks, Tavis. Great to be with you today.
Yeah, it's really exciting for me. You and I were just talking before this about the impact you had on my own studies at Durham University under John Barclay when I was working in Romans, and just your scholarship was such a boon to my own thinking, and just helping me process a lot of these questions about what is the Apostle Paul trying to say? What is the kind of the big picture that is going on here? So anyway, I just wanted to say that publicly and thank you for that. We won't get into all the nitty-gritty details, but just thank you for how you've helped me. And I'm sure a lot of the people listening in, whether in pastoral ministry or in academia, or just even as someone with a curiosity about the New Testament, you've been a real help for a lot of us.
Well, thank you so much, Tavis. That's very kind.
Well, what I wanted to do is jump right into it with starting out with your early days, because I've learned that as a young man, you actually were in quite a different place theologically than where you are now. And what I want to know is well, first tell us about it, but then how does that, or did that inform the man, the scholar, the pastor that you have become today?
Yeah. I grew up as a Roman Catholic, just outside of Salem, Oregon, and I have 7 brothers and sisters. I'm the 6th out of 8, and so I went to Catholic schools for 9 years. So I would say those years were really happy, and I loved being in my family. The Catholic community I was in was enjoyable to me, and but as I grew older, I'm not saying it's because of Catholicism, but I just wandered from any interest in spiritual things. My Catholic school closed. I ended up going to a public school. I met the person who became my wife. She was an evangelical Christian. She shared the gospel of Christ with me. She gave me a Bible. I never read the Bible as a Catholic. You know, different Catholic communities do different things, but in my community, reading the Bible was not something that was common at all. And so I'd never read it. I had no animus against Catholicism, but as I read scripture and was in the evangelical community, I confessed personal faith in Christ, and I became an evangelical Protestant theologically, with great appreciation for all the things I learned growing up as a Catholic. So much I learned that was helpful, but obviously there are theological differences there. And I suppose one of the things for me in it, you know, our biography influences our scholarship. The Apostle Paul's teaching on justification by faith was a revelation to me. I'm no Martin Luther. I wasn't seeking God ardently as a Catholic, but I did believe that my salvation depended on works when I was a Catholic. Not that I was seeking to be saved by works, that's what I believed. And when I discovered in the New Testament that justification and salvation are fundamentally by grace through faith, that was transforming for me. And from there, when I was converted when I was 17, from there, the next time I thought of it, I don't remember when that was anymore, but the next time I thought of it, I knew I was called to some form of ministry. I had no idea it would be a scholarly ministry at the time. I had no aspirations for that at such a young age.
Yeah, that's interesting. So at the age of 17, did you even conceive of what a scholar was?
No. And actually, even when I was going to seminary at 22, I actually thought that seminary was a waste of time because I wanted to go into the ministry right away. And I viewed seminary as an obstacle in my way. But what happened to me, because I was in wonderful, warm, popular, centrist evangelical circles, but there was not, let's just say the life of the mind wasn't emphasized. So I really didn't value that. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit. I read Francis Schaeffer in those years and C.S. Lewis. So the life of the mind was, I did some things like that. I read a little bit of J.I. Packer, but I still thought seminary wasn't needed. But what happened is I went to seminary and all of a sudden I took a class in hermeneutics and in Old Testament and church history. And I quickly realized I don't know anything. There's this whole world out there that I don't know anything about. And I was humbled. I realized I'm just a proud 22-year-old person, and I think I know a lot of things, and I have, and it's still true today. I'm 68, but I have so much to learn. There's so much out there that I don't know. So, for example, just growing up as a Catholic, I love church history. I was like, this is fascinating. What's happened in the last 2,000 years? I mean, I found it helpful, edifying, challenging. But I'd say that was true of my whole seminary education. So when I went to seminary, I was married by then, and both my wife and I were surprised that I loved studying. I always did well in school, but I was one of those students who did well in school by sliding by and doing the least possible, Yeah. And then I would do what I thought was fun in life. But it was a big surprise to me and my wife that suddenly I said, what I think is really fun is studying. So
it's interesting because I think the perception that a lot of us have, and I'm speaking now from my pre-PhD completion days, where you're looking at a scholar as, or just a general idea of a scholar, whether it's that general idea or a specific scholar you have in mind, and you're thinking of this person as in terms of superiority, maybe intellectually, or definitely in terms of their place in life. But it sounds like for you, what defines you as a scholar is, well, definitely I think the intellect has to be there, but it's this general sense of just curiosity. You know that you don't know, and so you're going to go and find out.
Yeah, I think that is so true of my own biography. I've always been, I've loved studying because I want to learn more. And, I've often said, if I had more lifetimes, there's so much more to learn, right? And that, Tavis, as well. I mean, there's just so much out there, and all of us can do a little piece, a little part of it. But that's why it's wonderful to have a community of scholars as well, though. We learn from one another. When I write my books, for example, my Hebrews commentary, which there's so much more I could have done. But I said to my friends over and over again as I was reading monographs, PhD dissertations on Hebrews and articles, and I said, I might disagree with part of the book, but I would say this book is so good. I'm learning so many things. I'm learning so many things from this book that I haven't thought about. And it's just really illuminating and helpful to me. So that's been striking to me over the years. And that's true of every project I've done. There's a lot of
community. Sorry, go ahead.
I just said there's a lot of gifted authors out there who've done great work.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I just want to touch on one other aspect of your youth that you mentioned. So the Roman Catholicism, that's very interesting, especially because I've heard you say elsewhere that one of your heroes, if not your main hero or inspiration for scholarship or for the career that you've had, I guess including ministry, would be Martin Luther, but which we can talk about in a minute. But you also mentioned elsewhere that you at one point were into like a Keswickian or Keswick theology. Can you talk a bit about how that's also been influential for your career going forward?
Yes. So when I became a believer at 17, that is the theology of sanctification I was taught for the next 5 years. So I was immersed in reading these books, and I was always a reader. So I read, Major Ian Thomas and Charles Trumbull and Oswald Chambers. I mean, it depends on who you put in there. Andrew Murray.
Yeah.
And I read a ton of these books. And first of all, I want to say, I had dinner with Major Ian Thomas at my youth pastor's home. And their emphasis on the life of Christ, the power of Christ in us, that's a very good message. But so I was young, but there was a kind of perfectionism I have to be careful because Keswick never says you can be perfect, but you can live on a kind of plane in Keswick theology that I always knew I didn't live at. So there was this sense of, I always had a little sense of discouragement, like, wow, I'd read these books and think, I'm just not there. I'm not where these people are. But then I think partially what saved me is this is how I would rationalize it. Well, I'm a young Christian. I'll get there. I hope. But where seminary really helped me, because I went to seminary and I began to see, there are different theologies out there of sanctification. And actually I started reading J.I. Packer, who was discouraged in his young life by Keswick theology. So I began to see the Reformed Lutheran understanding of sanctification. And I believe that was more biblical and more true to life. And I found that very liberating and freeing. I always want to say, Major Ian Thomas came to Bethel Seminary when I was teaching there, and he preached in chapel. And I just went up, and he was quite old then, probably in his 70s, maybe mid 70s. And he didn't remember us having dinner. Why would he, right? But I said to him, hey, thank you so much for your ministry to me as a young Christian. And I didn't say to him, and by the way, I disagree with you on something. So I just wanted to thank him because I did learn a lot from him. But I felt, for me, seminary was partially like those 4 years I did an MDiv and THM at Western. It was kind of like a retreat because especially in this theology of sanctification, because I feel like it was a burden on me that was lifted.
Yeah.
And that was helpful to me, and I was thankful I learned that at a younger age.
In this progression of your theological understanding, what importance did Luther's teaching on justification have for you, especially in terms of how Luther speaks of being justified afresh every morning? Whether we read Luther as saying it's the way we think of it, or we're actually being re-justified. I know that's a debate, but and then how does that tap into the concept of sanctification? But was Luther one of those main theologians that kind of helped turn the trajectory of your theology? Were there others that were part of that?
Yeah. I don't know. It's interesting. When did I start reading Luther? Because at seminary, where I went to seminary, the focus was more on the biblical languages and theology. So I read some of Luther, but I would say not a lot at the beginning. But I've read Luther more as I've lived life. But I would say Luther's notion of simul justus et peccator, we're justified in it, we're at the same time we're sinners. I embrace that, what I think is a truth. I think it can be misunderstood and perverted in certain ways, but I think that fits with what you said in the sense of Luther saying we have to relearn the gospel every day. These statements can be misunderstood, but John Piper was a pastor, and John Piper would say, I wake up every day and I'm not a Christian, or something like that. He didn't mean that in a technical way. But I think that's the sort of the same thing that Luther was getting after, which I found very helpful, maybe because I'm more introspective. When I look inside, do I have the resources to live the life God calls me to live? And I think Piper's answer was no, which I think is Paul's answer. I think Luther rightly reflects Paul. We don't have those resources in and of ourselves. Every day we're cast afresh on the grace of God. So in and of ourselves, we're sinners. We stray. And I have found actually in the last 20, 25 years, I preach through Galatians at our church. I think Luther expresses more poignantly than anyone I've read sort of the agony of Christian experience, because he experienced it. And so he captures it in such memorable and unforgettable paragraphs and sentences. So when I was preaching Galatians, maybe I did this too much. Sometimes I just read paragraphs from Luther and I'd say, but one of them that comes to my mind is he says, I'm paraphrasing him, but living by faith alone, he says it's easy to say, but to live it out in the agony of experience, he says, that is more difficult than anyone can say. And I think that is exactly right. We can say, of course, yes, we're justified by faith. And Luther says, if you say that blithely, and if you say that, oh, yes, of course, we all know that. Luther says, you don't know what you're talking about, because we're so prone to rely on our works, right? I mean, even, the way we talk, people say to me, you're a New Testament scholar, you've written these books, you've accomplished this. So you write, almost everything in life is like this. And what have you accomplished? What have you done? But that's not how we live in God's presence. We're poor and naked and blind and miserable in and of ourselves. And I just think Luther had such an insight into that. I mean, he's not the only one, right? But because he was an introspective person, I think he speaks to people very powerfully. Of course, Luther could be very mean and said some terrible things too. We all know that. So,
we take the good that we can. Yeah.
I mean, the things he said about the Jews, his interaction with Zwingli, but I always say to people, Luther was simul justus et peccator too. He was.
Yes, he was. One of the things in Luther, this is a side note, but that really has impacted my own journey of faith, is his concept of the hidden God. And not that it's his concept, but just the way he articulated this idea that, well, the reality that we don't see God face to face yet. And yet that drives us onwards in our life of faith, this expectation that one day we will see him. And that some of those of the past were privileged enough to see Christ, the manifestation of God, the second person of the Trinity in the flesh. And so, yeah, we have much to hope for. So this hiddenness of God leading to a hope in the consummation of what Christ has accomplished. You just mentioned a few interesting points here, including John Piper, who was your pastor, but also a very helpful preaching tip, which is quoting paragraphs from Luther. So for those of you who are watching, if Tom Schreiner does it, you can do it too. And maybe it's Augustine, or maybe it's Calvin, or maybe it's Luther, or maybe some other theologian you love. Honestly, though, I do this quite often when I preach, is I'll bring in, well, they're varying lengths of chunks, but some of the church fathers and even Aquinas, others that maybe the normal layperson doesn't have the time to read or know about. And it's a good way to expose your people to some of the greater thinkers of the past. But
if I can mention quickly, and even though I'm not a Catholic, I have often over the years quoted Chesterton. I love G.K. Chesterton. He's one of my favorites. And then Pascal and the Pensée. And I have read the Pensée many times, and I find that just one of the most profound books I've ever read. So I've quoted him a lot, and there's so many great people. But another one that's really I've found helpful is Bonhoeffer over the years.
Yes. So. Yeah. Now, have you read much Bonhoeffer?
Well, I've read a fair bit. I haven't read his whole corpus, but
it's quite a bit.
So, but I suppose Life Together, Cost of Discipleship, Christ the Center, Letters and Papers from Prison, Ethics. I'm no Bonhoeffer expert. I know there's many debates about how to interpret Bonhoeffer. I'm not qualified to enter that discussion. So
So back to Piper. John Piper was your pastor for quite a number of years, and I'd love to hear the influence he had upon your education and your ministry at the time, and even up until today.
So just a little chronology. So I finished Western Seminary in 1980. I went to Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, got my PhD there under Don Hagner, who was wonderful. Yeah. Then I taught for 3 years at Azusa Pacific University in Southern California. And in 1986, we moved to Minnesota to teach at Bethel Seminary in St. Paul. And I'd heard of John Piper because John did his Master of Divinity at Fuller. And, I heard John had come to the campus and gave a lecture. I wasn't there. But so when we were going to Minnesota, John, I heard, was pastoring in Minneapolis. John was not famous then. He hadn't written any of his popular books. So I said to my wife, I've heard of this scholar, and I don't, he's pastoring. And I said, I don't know if he's a good preacher, though. But I've heard. So we went to the church, and I was astonished at of course, John himself got a PhD under Leonard Goppelt. Goppelt died before he completed, but almost the whole thing was under Goppelt. So John himself is a New Testament PhD. So he's a very careful student of the scriptures, but also his rhetorical and oratorical and sermonic abilities were, I was, because I'd never heard of him as a preacher. This was 1986. We were amazed. So we were there in the next 11 years. Yeah, John, I would say that the thing that struck me about John the most is, if you talk about pathos, logos, and ethos, but his ethos, John lived what he preached. Obviously we're all sinners. We all fall short. But he lived in the inner city. He did not accumulate wealth. He's very sincere. So and then he loved God's word. And then the big picture of God that he had was inspiring. So yeah, he had a great influence on me. I love John. I really couldn't repay my debt to John's influence on my life. We left in 1997, so we were there 11 years. But I'm so thankful for him. We have our places where we disagree, but he's been an inspiration to me.
Yeah. And so after your time with John, you then went on to pastor a church. Is that correct?
Well, I came to Southern Seminary in 1997 in Louisville, Kentucky, and there was a little church plant, and I started, which had started already, but various things happened to the first pastor. So I started preaching at this church in February of 1998, and I preached through 2015. I never dreamed I'd do that for 17 years. I was simply going to be the bridge to the next person, and I was the bridge to the next person. Actually, we brought in the guy who's preaching now in 2008, and we started sharing the responsibilities. But I thought it'd be 3 or 4 years, but I loved it, and I learned so much, and it had a really significant impact on my scholarship, I'd say. I'm so thankful that I engaged in the ministry, because it made me think of my writing differently. So,
what would you say are some of the most important of your books that you wrote during that period where you were leading a church?
Yeah, well, my first edition of Romans came out then, right at the start. And then I wrote my Theology of the Apostle Paul. I have 2 editions of Romans, but also I wrote the first edition of 1st, 2nd Peter, and Jude. I wrote my book, The King and His Beauty, which I really enjoyed because that's a whole Bible theology. And I wrote my New Testament theology during that time. So I wrote that before I wrote The King and His Beauty. And then I wrote Galatians during that time as well. Maybe, there are other things I was working on in the midst of that as well. But those are the main things I worked on during those years. And I loved doing all of them. Usually after I did a commentary, I would write something where I didn't have to do quite as much research. It's kind of exhausting, which I'm in that stage again, because I just wrote a major, more technical commentary. I mean, some of the commentaries are so technical that I haven't written one of those, like the Hermeneia, but
Yeah. So that's fascinating to me that you managed to be so prolific while handling a preaching ministry and teaching, and presumably a family. Now, so your family, I've met your son Patrick, and you have other children as well, besides?
Right. Yeah, we have Daniel's pastoring in Oregon. He's been in a church there for 11 years on staff. Patrick's teaching in Kansas City at Midwestern. We have a son who's in the United Arab Emirates doing good work. And then our daughter is married to, she met a seminary student, so she's married to a person who's going into the ministry. Yeah. So we need to talk. I mean, people hear that. I never taught, hey, I never said to our kids, hey, you really should think of going into the ministry. Maybe I should have said that. I never said that. I never, looking back, I don't even think I prayed that. I just said to our kids, whatever you do, enjoy it and do it to the glory of God, And I never really dreamed so many of them would end up in ministry situations. But that makes me happy because I think they enjoyed being in our home. I think our kids would say, I hardly ever missed any of their games, and they all played a lot of sports. I was almost always there. I loved that. I loved going to their games and doing those things as they got older. The church started out small. It was a church plant. I wasn't doing all the things a pastor does. I was preaching. I met with the other leaders and the elders, but I wasn't doing tons of counseling. I couldn't have done that, right? I wasn't doing a lot of administration. So, yeah, I think I was living a pretty balanced life, actually. It's such a blessing to have other elders that I worked with. And our church, even to this day, is very collegial. I never felt like I'm the pastor, Tom's the pastor. It was never like that at us. It was always like we're pastors together. And it still has that feel. And that, for one thing, that's really freeing. I never felt like, boy, this church depends on me, Yeah. It just never had that. It never had that feel. So
yeah. And so were you building your sermons off of the things that you were working on in the classroom and or your writing projects?
Not necessarily. For example, I never preached through Hebrews.
Really?
And,
okay.
Yeah, which I wish I would have maybe, but no, I didn't link it with what I was working on at the time. But because I was a professor, I had taught almost every book of the New Testament individually, So it was a huge help in writing sermons. Now, of course, when I did Old Testament books, and I usually would switch. I'd do a New Testament book, then I'd do an Old Testament. Obviously, I'd had more work to do exegetically than when I was preparing a sermon from say, Romans, right? So, yeah.
So let's then talk about your scholarship, because you've written a lot and you've covered a lot of ground, not just the New Testament, but of course your biblical theology work. You've done quite a lot in Paul, as a lot of us know, especially with your commentary on Romans. Then worked on some other epistles within the New Testament, including Hebrews, I think most recently, right? But now we have your work on Revelation to look forward to, which I know you've done a little bit of pre-work in that. So tell us though, what is the most of your time now with your scholarship? Is it the Revelation commentary, and what do we have to look forward to after Revelation, if you know?
Yeah. So first of all, I wrote a semi-popular Revelation commentary in the ESV expository commentary, which is a 12-volume commentary series. So I did that. I forget even when that came out. I'm terrible at remembering dates, maybe in the last 10 years at least. Mm-hmm. Then I was supposed to give some lectures at Moore Theological College. And then, so I did some, lectures that are in this book now called Joy of Hearing, that I published with Crossway. And actually we're doing a whole biblical theology series. Of course, I never got there because of COVID. I mean, I was supposed to be there in 2020, but hopefully I'm going back in 2024, but it'll have to be a different book because now this one's published. So, and then I, several years ago, I started working on the Baker commentary on Revelation, which I finished it February this year. But of course, I'm not, I'm through with 95%, but I'm still reading a few things on it as they come across my desk. I didn't try to read everything. I mean, again, that's impossible. I tried to read representative. Again, wow, I just learned. Again, curiosity. I learned so much reading other people on Revelation. And yeah, so many great commentaries and monographs again. Now in Revelation, I have to say, some of the stuff I really disagree with. I mean, some of it's, I was trained in dispensationalism. I'm not a dispensationalist. So I can appreciate some insights from that school. But I was drawn to Revelation because I think, well, first of all, we live in a post-Christian society, and I think Revelation speaks to a post-Christian world in terms of the suffering of believers. And I think the message in evangelical churches often of Revelation, either people get into the prophecy chart, maybe that's less than it used to be, or they just ignore it. And they say that this book has nothing to say to us. But I think Christologically, in terms of who God is, judgment, the new creation that's coming, the reward for the saints, the call to perseverance, I think it's a very encouraging book, actually. So,
I had the Logos Live that we did, I think, a week or so ago was with Dayton Hartman. And if you're familiar with his work at all, he was trying to express the unity that we have in the teaching of Revelation, which essentially boils down to, well, I guess what he does is a creedal eschatology. So Jesus will come again to judge the living and the dead. The sense that Jesus is coming back, he will be victorious, is the thing we can all unify around. Now, you have said, though, that the one eschatological position you haven't yet taken is that of postmillennialism. But on the positive side, how would you concisely explain your current millennial view?
Yeah, well, I would love it if postmillennialism were true. That'd be one. And maybe it is. I haven't seen it, but that would be very encouraging. So I don't emphasize my millennial view. That's not why I'm interested in Revelation. I tentatively am embracing this new creation millennial view that's been, it's in a dissertation by Webb Mealy. There's a recent article defending it in Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society by Eckhart Schnabel. And you see it in his little book, 40 Questions on the End Times, or whatever that book is called. That view could be wrong. I don't hold to everything Mealy says about the future. People immediately ask me that. Well, Mealy believes this or that. But what I like about the new creation millennial view is it's sort of a via media between the pre-mill and the amill. And maybe I'm just punting. My previous commentary, I was all millennial. I think that's a very difficult question. I think we just extend charity on this matter. I even say to people, yeah, probably what I say in the millennium is probably wrong, but there it is. But I'm not going to die for it.
No.
At the end of the day, I thought, oh man, this is so hard. Should I just write, I don't know. But I thought, I'll just put this out there for the sake of discussion. And I slightly lean in this direction. And if I could just say a word about it, the new creation millennialism is the idea that the millennium is the first age of the new creation. So the millennium is part of the new creation. It's not, you don't have people dying in the millennium. So it's part of the new creation. So that's different from the pre-mill view, and it's different from the amill view in that sense.
Yeah. Well, let's see how much the comment section light up on that one, because we know eschatology is always people very, very keen on discussing. Since we're talking about theological difficulties, I wanted to present another question that someone in the comments, which is one that I'm actually very interested in from my own work in Romans. But the question is that one of the major problems with Protestant interpretations of Paul, especially Romans and Galatians, is that typically those interpretations are done as if Paul was addressing either Roman Catholicism, well, not either, but they're done as if Paul was addressing Roman Catholicism or kind of a works-based salvation that we see in the Roman Catholic model, rather than actually addressing the issue of his day, which was Second Temple Judaism. Do you think that we're still dealing with this? The corollary question would be, how has the new perspective on Paul, and I guess now the radical new perspective, how have those helped or hindered the discussion? Where do you see this discussion going now?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. I would say, the new perspective on Paul, it depends on when you date it, but if you date it from E.P. Sanders' book, 1977, I don't know how new that is anymore, right? that was 45 years ago. But and really, we have Stendhal preceding, as you know, Sanders. So I think the new perspective, I guess what I would say is it raised questions that were helpful, and I think it also spurred us in a way to remove caricatures of what Judaism was, or historically, and furthermore, I mean, there's so much, as you know, we could talk about so many things, but I think I think the new perspective rightly reminded us that there is the inclusion of the Gentiles in Paul's gospel. That's a very important theme that sometimes we've neglected, the inclusion theme. So I think there's many dimensions of the new perspective that are helpful. I would say, and Sanders' work and others has prevented us from being simplistic and talking about Second Temple Judaism. But then I would say I agree with those who say that Sanders in his own right is a bit too simplistic, and that there are indications of an emphasis on works and obedience that no, it's not quite the same thing as Roman Catholics, but there are analogies to it, I think, that are closer than someone like a Sanders or a Wright or a Dunn would say. Although Dunn, as you know, Dunn sort of moderated near the end and sort of ended up saying, but there's truth in the old perspective. So I think that the old perspective, the view, I would say, of the reformers, fundamentally got it right. There is a polemic against works. I think we see that in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. It isn't because Jews are particularly prone to works, but because human beings are particularly prone to boast in what they've accomplished. So I like Mark Elliott's book, The Survivors of Israel, Friedrich Ava Marie's book, putting in English, Torah and Covenant, the first volume of Carson, Seifert, and O'Brien, the variegated. What's the title of that again? The variegated Judaism. Now I lost
it's
it.
Two volumes of essays. We'll look that up.
Some of what Andrew Doss has done, and Simon Gathercole and others. Yeah. I think that they've rightly shown. Look, the new perspective and your own supervisor, Barclay, the new perspective is overstepped in its estimation of what Paul's doing, as if there's no polemic against works righteousness in Paul, and I think it's there. So obviously that debate is ongoing. In terms of the radical apocalyptic view of Paul, I mean, there's in some sense, I mean, that view is more compatible with. It depends on how you appropriate it, but it's more compatible, I think, with the old perspective in some respects. I think it depends on who we're talking about. I think there are other weaknesses. It depends on the particular author we have in mind. So, but I think there's a lot of truth in J. Lewis Martin's apocalyptic antinomies and Martin DeBoer's work and so forth and so on. I suppose I would take issue, especially, if you put Doug Campbell in that category, which I think I would. I think Doug says many things I disagree with. So there's four views of the Apostle Paul, and so it was Doug, me, I think Michael Barber, and Mark Nanos. So, and then no, Luke Johnson did it. Well, I think it's Luke Johnson. Yeah, Luke Johnson. So it's funny because in that book, I mean, Johnson he's Catholic, he didn't totally agree with me, but I found myself closest to Johnson, So
going all the way back to your early days.
Yeah. I felt that we were the two closest. I don't know if he thought that. So
he's a very nice individual as well.
I've actually never met him, but I enjoyed that discussion.
So we have some people asking about, and this will relate to the way that you do scholarship, is do you use Logos, and if so, do you have advice for best practices of using it for either scholarship or preaching?
Well, I'm not a great computer person. Let's just say that I probably don't have a lot of great advice, but I do find it helpful. When I'm looking up, especially when I'm in preaching and teaching, and I want to find a commentary or a source. I was raised, early on with accordance, so I tend to use that for my language tool. But I use Logos, when I'm doing secondary sources, and I found it very helpful. It's very easy. I love the fact that you can access books in that way. And I didn't tell you, I'm writing a little book right now on judgment, and I use Logos, especially for secondary sources. But I'm not I'm not excellent on the computer. I'm not Andy Naselli,
I remember during my PhD, I would have, I think I would have up to 10, maybe even 12 commentaries, including yours, open on Romans. You could just line them all up and have them all linked. So if you were on, say, Romans 4:1, which was a part of my work, boom, they all were what everyone had to say on Romans 4:1 or whatever passage it was. So yeah, same as yourself. I find that with the secondary sources, especially, and our language sources too, have really excelled, especially in recent years. So that was a huge boon to my own work as a part-time preacher and a PhD student. We have another question that I wanted to throw your way, and stick with me as I read it because it's a little bit of a tongue twister. But here we go anyway. We'll give it a go. In your estimation, can one profess federal headship to be true with us falling in Adam and him breaking the commandment of God in the garden, yet not maintain that there's enough in Scripture to hold to a garden covenant?
Wow, that is a.
There's some
Uh,
curiosity for you.
I don't. I would. I mean, that's a systematic theology question, which I'm very interested in. I so I'm not sure what this person is after completely, but I would think that it's hard to describe federal headship without a covenantal understanding, because the word federal is itself a covenantal word. I mean, that's just the Latin word for covenant. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it'd be hard to separate those, because once you're saying federal headship, you're saying covenant headship.
Yeah.
Uh, so
Yeah.
I think
That's
they,
the answer.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 I think if you said there's a kind of headship that's not federal, then you might not see a covenant relationship.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
well, Tom, let me ask you one more question because we are coming near the end of our time. I could keep talking to you for a long time, though, especially if we get into more new perspective stuff. But this is a really interesting one because of your work in Revelation. Someone asks, do you think the bow in the first seal of Revelation 6 could be a rainbow instead of a war bow, and a theme that John picks up from Genesis 9, Ezekiel 1? Um, is that a possibility? Is
Um, well, almost everything's a possibility in Revelation. I I do not interpret it that way. However, I do take the minority view that the first seal, the rider on the white horse, is Jesus. That is definitely the minority reading. I think there's an intertextual connection to chapter 19. Of course, the pushback against that could be, right, the writer in chapter 6 is a parody of Christ. So clearly that's possible. I have a friend who teaches with me, and he said, Tom, I basically agree with everything you've written on Revelation, except for your understanding of the rider and the white horse in Revelation 6. He says, I think you're wrong on that. So, but I don't think it's referring to the rainbow. I still think it's so the way I understand those seal judgments, I think they parallel what we see in the eschatological discourse in Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 21. And I think that each of the seals represents something we find in the eschatological discourse. And this one refers to the progress of the gospel. The gospel will be preached to the whole world, and then the end will come, Jesus says. That's how I understand the bow. There's a conquering message of the gospel that's going out all through history. So yeah, maybe that could be connected to the rainbow. You could say, okay, God's fulfilling his covenant in some way. I didn't go that way with that, but that's certainly interesting and possible. Yeah.
All right, well, let's wrap things up with a question that I'm very curious about, but I've also seen someone else ask it, is if someone wants to begin reading your books, if they've never read any of your works before, where would you suggest that they begin?
I think maybe I'd say The King and His Beauty, because
Okay.
that's my whole biblical theology, and I think it's pretty accessible. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a good start. If you wanted to read something smaller, I wrote a little book on covenant and God's purpose of the world for Crossway. That one's a very short book. The King and His Beauty is longer. So that's
Okay.
another possibility.
So that's a good starting point. What about for those people who want to get really just bite off as much as they can chew right away and get really to the heart of 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 what you are passionate about writing about in terms of biblical theology and New Testament studies? Would it be your book on justification?
Yeah, it could be my book Faith Alone. Yeah,
Yeah.
or my book on Paul as
Mm-hmm.
well. Yes, I didn't mention my book Faith Alone. I really enjoyed writing that book. That was a lot of fun. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Well, there you go. There's two great places to start. And I was also going to say for easier access, your Theology of Revelation. Maybe that might be a good one.
Yeah. That's my
Yeah.
newest one, The Joy of Hearing. And I'm hoping, Lord willing, if I have enough birthdays after I do this book on judgment, I'm wanting to write a commentary on Ephesians. But it'll be English text because I have a contract with Baker. I told them there's so many good Greek text commentaries on Ephesians. I don't know what I could offer on the Greek text, but I said maybe if I reflected a bit more theologically on the book.
Yeah.
So they said they bought it. So that's what I hope to do after I finish this little book on judgment.
Well, I don't think any of us have any doubts that your Greek is good, considering your work on the ESV and the CSB, which could be a whole nother discussion. So, lastly, words of encouragement might you be able to offer those of us listening in terms of ministry, in terms of being a person, just a lay person within the church, and even those young scholars in the audience? What would you have to say to us just to encourage us to press on and keep up the good fight?
Yeah, wow, that is such a profound question. I think I would just say, just pastorally, I think for us to stay close to the Lord and I think to stay in community with God's people. I think it's tempting. Life can be hard, and I think it's tempting to isolate ourselves from others, and we can be hurt. I mean, this is just on my mind at this moment. We can be hurt in our relationship with other Christians, and I think we can flee those relationships. But I think I've been so strengthened in my life by staying in fellowship with other believers, and we're all fallible. We're all flawed. We all sin against each other, and I think it can be tempting to not remain in relationships with others in the church. And so, I mean, I'd probably say something different another day, but that's what comes to my mind today.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Schreiner. I've really enjoyed talking with you both before we went live and especially now while we've been live. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And we just wish you the best with your ongoing scholarly pursuits and ministry and family and everything. Thank you.
Thanks, Tavis. I really enjoyed this. So it was a lot of fun.